Romeo Phillion that was served 31.5 years for murder did not commit.
The story begins on August 9th, 1967, when fireman Leopold Roy was stabbed to death. Roy's wife, Mildred, described the perpetrator to Ottawa police. Based on the description, Ottawa police placed Romeo and his twin brother, Donald, in a police lineup. The police quickly learned that Donald had been out of town during the time of the murder and as such released him. On August 13th, Romeo was back at the police station, this time for a charge that was completely unrelated to the stabbing of Roy. During his visit, Mildred, Roy's wife, stated that Romeo shared a resemblance with the man that stabbed Roy. However, as she was uncertain that Romeo was the assailant, he was released. For the next 4.5 years, the investigation did not make any significant discoveries to the death of Roy. During the time period, Mildred had identified 3 other men who resembled her husband's killer. All 3 suspects were released without any charges. On January 11, 1972, Romeo fell into trouble with the law yet again. He was arrested for the armed robbery of a taxi driver. Though this robbery was not connected to the murder of Roy, it is here where Romeo falsely confessed to committing the murder of fireman Leopold Roy. While being interviewed by Detective Hano, Romeo asked if his lover Neil had told the detective anything related to the crime. Hano played along with Romeo's charade and said that Neil told him a lot about the things you bragged about to him. After the statement by the detective, Romeo confessed to killing the fireman. Romeo stated he wanted to meet with Neil before making a full confession. Shortly after this meeting, Romeo lived up to his promise and signed the full confession. Neil then told the police that Romeo had made a similar confession to him only a few days prior to his arrest. Romeo's trial began on October 16, 1972. The Crown prosecution had built their case on 3 key pieces of evidence. A. Mildred's eyewitness testimony, completely disregarding the fact that she had identified 4 people as Roy's killer. B. Romeo's voluntary confession. And C. Romeo's earlier confession to Neil. The defense counsel argued that despite the false confessions Romeo made, he was innocent. The defense interviewed 2 expert witnesses who both stated that Romeo suffers from antisocial personality disorder, and due to this disorder, Romeo had the propensity to lie and invent stories to make him feel important. According to experts, Romeo likely falsely confessed to murdering Leopold Roy due to his desire to feel important. It is important to note that on the same night Romeo falsely confessed to the crime, he recanted his confession to a police officer. He told the officer that he and Neil planned to scheme the police department by sending them on a wild goose chase, which would let them collect the reward money from Neil, telling the officers that Romeo had confessed to him prior to coming to the police station. After recanting his statement, Romeo maintained his innocence from the moment he recanted to the present. Arthur Conan, Romeo's lawyer, brought up the fact that the police mishandled evidence, as the hair samples taken from Romeo and the fingernail scrapings, blood, and hair samples taken from Leopold were lost by the police department. Despite the fact that these samples were lost, the jury found Romeo guilty on November 7, 1972. He was sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. Romeo tried to appeal his conviction to the Ontario Court of Appeal, arguing that the police investigation had many problems in it, and that he was not given the presumption of innocence to which all accused persons are entitled. He was unsuccessful, and the court dismissed his appeal on September 3, 1974. Romeo did not give up there. He filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, but unfortunately, the appeal was dismissed on March 22, 1977. Even after losing at the highest court of appeal, Romeo wrote letters to the Minister of Justice, maintaining his innocence and stating that he was out of town during the time of the murder. Unfortunately, nothing was done, and these letters did not help his case. 20 years after his conviction, Romeo's parole officer gave him an envelope which had police reports from his Corrections Canada file. One of these reports were prepared by Detective McCombie on April 12, 1968. This report stated that Romeo had an alibi for the time of Roy's murder. A service station operator from Trenton had confirmed that Romeo was in Trenton between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. on the day Leopold was murdered, making it impossible for Romeo to be in Ottawa by 2:45, which is the time the murder took place. The evidence of an alibi was not mentioned in court, and his lawyer had even said there was no issue with the fact that Romeo was in Ottawa during the time of the murder. On May 15, 2003, the Innocence Project and AIDWIC submitted an application for the reviewal of the new evidence that pegged Romeo in Trenton at the time of the murder. Though Romeo could have applied for parole earlier, he felt that applying for parole would be equivalent to admitting that he committed the crime he was being accused for. Romeo's case was reopened on August 2, 2006, where the judge heard why the evidence of Romeo's alibi was kept from his lawyer. The court found that the Crown did not intentionally convict Romeo, as they were genuinely unaware of his innocence. McCombie testified that he did not disclose Romeo's alibi as he had received tow records that indicated that Romeo could have made it back to Ottawa to commit the murder. However, there was no evidence that proved that McCombie made the trip and found evidence to discredit Romeo's alibi. Though the justice did not directly reprimand McCombie, he stated that he found the lack of documentation to be disturbing. Regardless of the sloppy police investigation, it was clear that the prosecution had a copy of the April 1968 report, which was not disclosed to the defense counsel. Justice Mullay stated that had Cogan known about this report, Romeo's trial would have gone very differently, as this report would have been gold in his hands. The Court of Appeal overturned Romeo's conviction and ordered a new trial. The Crown withdrew the murder charge against Romeo on April 29, 2010, as there was no chance that a new trial would result in the conviction of Romeo. Though it is clear that Romeo voluntarily confessed to the murder of Leopold, the admissibility of his statement is questionable. Due to his antisocial personality and borderline personality disorder, his confession should not have been deemed illegible. Further, the Court of Appeal heard testimony from Dr. Gudjonson, who's a world-renowned expert on the psychology of false confessions. It was found that in cases such as Leopold's, voluntary confessions are common. This is done for a variety of reasons, including a desire for notoriety, an unconscious need to expiate guilt over unrelated transgressions, an inability to distinguish fact from fantasy, a desire to aid and protect someone, typically the real criminal, and or revenge, either on someone who the confessor also implicates or on the police whose time is wasted by the false admission. According to the confessions rule defined and outlined in R.V. Oinkle, the court must consider whether the subject has an operating mind in order to deem a confession voluntary. Due to the fact that Romeo suffered from two different psychological disorders, it is appropriate to say that he was not in the correct mindset when giving his confession, and as such, his confession should not be deemed admissible. However, due to the fact that RV Oinkle took place in 2000, the confessions rule was not active during Romeo's trial. Further, the sloppy police investigation is also to blame for Romeo's wrongful conviction. The police force was incredibly disorganized and frequently lost key evidence. They also did not keep records of their investigations. This, combined with the Crown's failure to disclose the report from April 1968, is what caused Romeo to become wrongfully convicted and serve 31.5 years in prison. In present day, Crown prosecutors are required to disclose all evidence to defense counsel, including the evidence the Crown does not intend to use in court. Lastly, it is likely that the jury trying Romeo's trial weighted the eyewitness testimony from Mildred very heavily. Despite the popular belief that eyewitness testimony is highly credible, this is untrue. Witnesses make confident yet incorrect identifications at an alarming rate. 77% of the 225 wrongfully convicted Innocence Project exonerations in the United States were due to mistaken eyewitness identification. Though Romeo Phillion was found not guilty after a lengthy legal battle, the 3 decades he spent in prison were due to poor professional police conduct, incorrect eyewitness testimony, and the lack of understanding psychological disorders in the legal system. Despite his brutal treatment, Romeo's chance at any compensation was met at an end in May 2013, when Superior Court Justice dismissed the $14 million lawsuit against the Attorney General and 2 police officers that had investigated Romeo's case. Furthermore, after Romeo confessed, the police did not look into any other suspects, as they were using tunnel vision. Romeo had been in and out of the police station many times, thus his confession made him a prime suspect. Furthermore, as Leopold was a fireman, the police were likely met with an urgency to convict somebody, as firemen are considered to be noble people. And as they are public servants, this creates more of an agency for the police to find somebody to blame. And when somebody confesses, it is easier for the police to point fingers.